Okay, so you're here with us because you really want to understand what's actually happening in the world,
Yeah.
without getting bogged down in all the craziness of the news cycle. And that's really what this deep dive is all about. We want to help you extract those really important insights from all the sources that you sent us, about the most pressing global events.
Yeah, and today we are really focusing on three areas that are all kind of interconnected. We're going to be looking at some recent reports, including some analysis of geolocated images by Professor Aaron Alves, and then also some official updates, from April 7th, which was yesterday, and today, Tuesday. So we're going to dissect, kind of, like a frog in biology class, the evolving military situation that's happening over in Ukraine. And we're going to pay really close attention to the Kursk front and some other areas where there's a lot of action happening right now.
Right. And after that, we're going to shift gears a little bit and take a look at what could be, a really big development. There have been claims that Chinese fighters have been captured fighting alongside Russian forces. So if this is true, we need to explore what that means geopolitically.
And then finally, we're going to wrap up by looking at this kind of concerning combination of things that are happening. On the one hand, we've got these stalled nuclear arms control talks, between the U.S. and Russia. And then on the other hand, we've got this escalating trade war between the U.S. and China. So these might seem like two totally separate things, but they could actually have a really huge impact on, global stability and peace and stuff. So our main goal today is to help you understand all of this stuff. But we want to do it in a way that's clear, that's structured. We don't want to just, throw a bunch of information at you and hope that it sticks.
That's definitely not what we want. We want you to actually understand this. Okay, so let's jump right into Ukraine. Professor Alves' analysis seems to show, some pretty significant Russian advancements on that eastern front. It sounds like things are moving pretty quickly over there.
They are. From what I've seen, Professor Alves was looking at a bunch of geolocated images from yesterday, April 7th. And it definitely seems like Russian forces are making progress in several key areas, starting in the Kursk Oblast, specifically near Grievo, which is south of Sudza. So we're seeing reports of Russian forces pushing both westward and southward. It kind of looks like they're building on, what they were doing in this area before and maybe trying to really cement their control there.
And I think it's important to note that it's not just that southern part of the Kursk region, right? And it seems like there's movement further north as well, closer to Belgorod.
That's a good point. Yeah, Professor Alves is showing advances in Demidovka, too, which is north of Kursk and really close to Belgorod. But the interesting thing here is that, remember, we've been hearing all these reports about confirmed Ukrainian activity in Belgorod itself. So, these border regions are really volatile right now. Lots of back and forth, very dynamic. And then if we shift our focus a little bit east, around Siversk, it looks like Russian forces are applying pressure from multiple directions. So we've got Serebryanka to the north, Bilohorivka to the northeast, and then Verkhnokamianska to the east. And in Verkhnokamianska, they've actually made a pretty notable advance.
Yeah, I think we've all heard those names in the news quite a bit lately. What's happening further south, though?
Well, if we go southwest, near Toretsk, there are reports of a Russian advance on this place called the Central on a Mine Waste Pile. These kind of industrial sites can be strategically important because they offer cover and defensive positions. And then if we keep going south towards Pokrovsk, we're seeing reports of gains in Uspinivka to the southwest and then directly south in Lysivka. And they've made advancements in both the central and the western parts of Lysivka. So just like you were saying, it's a broad push across multiple parts of the front.
Yeah, Professor also mentioned some reports that were unconfirmed, right?
Exactly. We got to be careful about that. Not everything we hear is necessarily true. So Russian sources have claimed they've captured Priviln, which is northeast of Velika Novosilka. And they're also saying that they've advanced north of Vesali and Berlatska and to the northeast outskirts of Shevchenko, which is northwest of Berlatska. But Professor Alves is really careful to point out that there's no visual confirmation of these claims yet, and the Ukrainian side hasn't acknowledged them either, and nobody's really been able to independently verify them. So yeah, we got to take those with a grain of salt for now.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, I want to zero in on the Kursk region specifically.
Yeah.
It seems like Russia's really determined to take back full control there, and they're making some progress.
Yeah, that definitely seems to be a top priority for them. Professor Alves pointed out some statements from the Kursk governor, Alexander Kinstein, and also some reports in Russian state media. It sounds like they think they're pretty close to regaining complete control of the western part of Kursk. Kinstein seemed pretty optimistic after that whole Russian flag-raising thing in Guevo. And there's this quote from a TASS military source. They said that Russian forces just need to push the Ukrainian units out of Gornal and Alishnya, and then they'll have control of the entire Kursk region. So it's clear that they're laser focused on that area.
And it's kind of crazy how different the estimates of controlled territory are, right?
It is, yeah. So the Deep State War Map, which, everybody uses because it's so detailed, it shows Ukraine holding around 58 square kilometers of Russian territory inside Kursk. But, last year Kyiv was claiming that they controlled like 1,400 square kilometers. So that just shows you how quickly things can change in this conflict. It's so dynamic, and the lines are constantly shifting.
Speaking of shifting lines, we saw Zelensky confirm that Ukrainian forces are operating in the Belgorod region, which is inside Russia. That was a pretty big deal, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It was on Monday that Zelensky finally admitted that Ukrainian military units are actually active inside the Belgorod region, right next to Kursk. And he said that they're doing this to protect the Sumy and Kharkiv regions of Ukraine from Russian attacks. He even said, and I'm quoting here, the war needs to go back to where it came from. So it seems like he's saying that they're just defending themselves, basically.
But of course, we're also hearing a different perspective from Russia on what's happening in Belgorod.
Right, yeah. So this Russian commander, Apti Aldanov, he told RIA news agency that the situation in Belgorod is under control after that alleged Ukrainian border incursion a couple of weeks ago. This sounds like they're trying to calm things down, reassure their people that everything's fine on the border, even though Ukraine has confirmed they're operating there.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like a very unstable and contested border region. And I think Professor Alves makes a good point when he says that we need to be really careful about the information we're getting from all sides, especially since we still don't know for sure when that Guevo video was filmed.
Absolutely, yeah. It's like Reuters was able to figure out where that video was filmed using satellite imagery and stuff.
Yeah.
But they couldn't confirm the exact date. And that just shows how hard it is to get accurate information, in real time from a war zone. It's a good reminder for everybody to think about where information is coming from and if there are any biases before they just accept it as fact.
All right, let's move on to something that could have even bigger consequences. Zelensky's claim about those captured Chinese fighters. This has the potential to change everything geopolitically.
It really does. So on Tuesday, President Zelensky comes out and says that Ukrainian forces have captured 2 guys who he says are Chinese fighters, and that they were fighting on the Russian side in eastern Ukraine. He even posted a video on X supposedly showing one of them.
But we know that China and Russia are pretty close, right? But Beijing has always said that they're not directly involved in the war. So Zelensky is basically contradicting them.
Yeah, he is. China's official line is that they're neutral and that they're not sending troops or anything like that. But Zelensky says he has evidence that there are actually quite a few Chinese citizens fighting with Russian units. And this is where it gets tricky. Professor Alves would probably say that the big question here is, are these guys just volunteers, or are they actually connected to the Chinese military in some way? That's a huge difference, and it would change everything geopolitically.
So what's Kyiv doing about this? Are they trying to get some answers from Beijing?
Yeah, apparently they're asking the Chinese government for a formal explanation. But as of right now, the Chinese Foreign Ministry hasn't said anything publicly. And that silence is kind of deafening, It can mean a lot of different things.
And Zelensky himself seemed to have a pretty clear interpretation of what this alleged Chinese involvement means.
Yeah, he's not sugarcoating it. He basically said that the fact that there are Chinese citizens and fighters from other countries, too, fighting in Ukraine means that Putin doesn't want this war to end. And he also hinted that this whole thing could be used as an excuse for European countries to send even more troops to Ukraine. He's basically saying that this could make the situation even worse.
Right. And just the idea of China getting involved in the European conflict, even indirectly, is a pretty scary thought. It could really destabilize the whole world.
It absolutely could, yeah. If it turns out that China is involved in this war in any way, that's a massive game changer. It would completely change the dynamics of the conflict, and it would have ripple effects all over the world. We need to keep a very close eye on this.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to our third topic, nuclear arms control, and this whole trade war that's brewing between the U.S. and China. From what I'm hearing, it doesn't sound like a new nuclear treaty is going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, That's unfortunately what it's looking like. Some high-ranking officials in the Kremlin said on Tuesday that a new nuclear arms reduction treaty with the United States is pretty much impossible right now. They said that there's just no trust between the two countries.
Yeah, Dmitry Peskov, he's the Kremlin spokesperson. He was really blunt about it, wasn't he?
He was. He said that it's almost impossible to even imagine starting negotiations for a new agreement to replace New START, which expires in February 2026. And he kept saying that there has to be trust for these kinds of talks to work, because they're dealing with really sensitive stuff. And he doesn't think that trust exists right now.
He did say there might be a way to rebuild that trust, though.
Yeah, he said that if Putin and Trump were both willing to put in the effort, they might be able to get things back on track. So it's kind of like he's putting the ball in the U.S.'s court.
And all of this is happening while we're in the middle of what some people are calling the worst security crisis since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, the war in Ukraine has definitely made things a lot worse between Russia and the West. And that's why nuclear weapons are back in the spotlight, unfortunately. It's kind of scary when you think about it. Russia and the U.S. have something like 88% of all the nuclear weapons in the world, according to the Federation of American Scientists.
And then you've got all these other countries with nuclear weapons, too, right?
Right. China, France, the UK, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. They all have their own agendas and strategies, which just makes the whole situation even more complicated.
And one of the big concerns right now is that China is rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal. Both Washington and Moscow are worried about this.
Yeah, that's definitely throwing a wrench into the whole strategic balance. China's growing nuclear capability is a huge wild card, and nobody's really sure what it means for the future.
And then, of course, we have Dmitry Medvedev, who's basically saying that we're on the verge of nuclear war.
Yeah, his assessment was pretty grim. Medvedev, who's the former president of Russia and now the deputy chairman of the Security Council, said that the risk of nuclear conflict is higher than ever before, and he blamed the West. Specifically their support for Ukraine. He's basically saying that they're pushing us towards World War III.
Which is pretty ironic considering that he was the one who signed New START with Obama back in 2010.
Exactly. Medvedev used to be seen as a moderate, but now he's one of the most hawkish voices in the Kremlin. And what he's saying is probably a pretty good indication of what Putin and his inner circle are thinking.
And Medvedev doesn't think there's any chance of nuclear disarmament, even if the war in Ukraine ends.
Nope, he doesn't. He said that nuclear disarmament is off the table for the next few decades, no matter what happens in Ukraine. So he clearly believes that nuclear weapons are here to stay.
And he basically dismissed France and the UK's nuclear capabilities as insignificant.
Yeah, he called them mediocre compared to Russia and the US. It seems like he's trying to downplay their role in the whole nuclear deterrence game.
And the worst part is that he thinks even more countries are going to try to get nuclear weapons.
Exactly. That's what he said, that the arms race is only going to get worse, even if the war in Ukraine ends. So, yeah, not exactly a rosy outlook.
All right, let's switch gears again and talk about the trade war between the U.S. and China. Trump has been making some pretty aggressive statements lately.
Yeah, and this is happening on top of everything else we just talked about, which is already pretty stressful. So yeah, Trump is taking a much harder line now, and he's even talking about tariffs of over 100% on Chinese goods.
It seems like he's trying to force China to negotiate.
It does. He's basically saying, come to the table or else. It's a really risky move, though.
And the global markets are freaking out, right?
Oh, yeah. There was a lot of panic when Trump first made these threats. Things calmed down a little bit on Tuesday, but there's still a lot of fear that this could trigger a global recession and disrupt the whole international trading system.
And China isn't backing down either. They called Trump's actions blackmail and said they're going to fight back.
Right, they're not going to just roll over. China is furious, and they're saying that they'll retaliate if Trump goes through with these tariffs. This is after Trump threatened to raise tariffs to 104% in response to the tariffs that China imposed last week.
But Trump also hinted that a deal is still possible.
Yeah, he said that China wants a deal, but doesn't know how to start the negotiations. So he's basically waiting for them to call him. It's a very strange way of doing diplomacy, but that's Trump for you.
And meanwhile, businesses on both sides are starting to feel the effects.
Absolutely. Chinese manufacturers are saying that their profits are going to plummet, and they're looking at moving their factories to other countries. And Citibank even lowered their GDP growth forecast for China in 2025 because of all this uncertainty.
And U.S. companies are affected too, right?
Right. Some of them are already passing on the costs to consumers in the form of surcharges. Micron, the chip manufacturer, is doing that. And clothing retailers are delaying orders and not hiring new people because they're worried about how much their imports are going to cost.
So in the end, it's going to be the consumers who pay the price.
Yeah, everything's going to get more expensive. They were saying that sneakers made in Vietnam could go from $155 to $220 because of these tariffs. That's a pretty big jump.
And some people are already starting to hoard goods because they're afraid of prices going up even more.
Yeah, that's a natural reaction. There was a story about a guy in New Jersey, Thomas Jennings, who's stocking up on all kinds of stuff. People are getting worried.
And China is criticizing the U.S. economic model, too.
Yeah, they were really angry about something that J.D. Vance, the U.S. vice president, said. Vance basically said that the U.S. economy depends on borrowing money from Chinese farmers to buy their products. China called that ignorant and impolite, which shows how tense things are right now.
And other countries are trying to stay out of the crossfire, right?
Yeah, they're trying to protect themselves. Vietnam asked for a 45-day delay on the tariffs, and Indonesia offered to lower taxes on some U.S. imports, like electronics and steel.
And the EU is already dealing with tariffs from the U.S.
Right. Trump already put tariffs on European cars and metals, and now he's threatening to add a 20% tariff on other stuff starting on Wednesday. So, yeah, things aren't looking good for transatlantic trade.
And it seems like nobody is safe. They're even talking about tariffs on European alcohol.
Yeah, that's a big concern for the alcohol industry. And European pharmaceutical companies are worried, too, because they think they might have to move their businesses to the U.S. if things keep going this way.
Okay, so to sum up, we've got this really volatile situation in Ukraine with Russia making some gains. Then there's this whole thing about Chinese fighters being captured, which could have massive geopolitical implications. And to top it all off, we've got stalled nuclear talks and a trade war that's getting worse by the day. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. We've got a lot of problems right now. War, potential new alliances, nuclear weapons, and economic conflict. The world is a pretty messy place right now.
So here's something for you to think about. Out of all these issues, the war, the shifting alliances, the nuclear threat, and the trade war, which one do you think will have the biggest impact on the world in the next year? And what are the key things you're going to be watching to see how it all plays out? Don't just focus on the headlines. Think about the deeper forces that are driving all of this.
That's a great question. Yeah, think about how these different issues are connected and how they might influence each other.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you learned something, and we encourage you to keep digging deeper into these important issues.
Absolutely. It's important to stay informed,